My assumption here is that the audiences that I've been a participant in are all very capable of understanding things like AI, machine learning, robotics, PRA, and all that lot. And particularly, there's been a lot of talk about pivoting, resiliency, and agility. So we kind of know what that means, but maybe as we execute these, let's call them strategies, because they're not really, they're just typically tactics as they're deployed, we bump into lots of issues, issues that we knew were in the business, but as we try and accelerate parts of the business and try and move in maybe a more responsive way, we trip over these things. And it leads me to suggest that it's not the guys in the supply chain that need a clearer vision of supply chain. I think this really does need to the point that David's just made, is the C-suite, the CEO really needs to get really animated about the quality of their supply chain and the kind of things they expect from it and what they're prepared to put in it. We should be thinking about the holistic nature of the supply chain, the horizontal nature of the supply chain, not just in our business, but beyond our business, down into our supply network. And if we're using partners, into our distribution network, if we're not distributing directly to stores ourselves with our own warehouse or our own trucks. And then we add into that kind of almost a variant on a supply chain called the singles picking and delivery and dispatching kind of supply chain, which is e-commerce. So there's a lot of complexity in this area, and we, to the point that David made, is organize ourselves in these swim lanes, which may have suited the past to really make us turn up every day. We're doing our job. It's fine. It's great. But now this disruption has allowed us to think very much like the supply chain has to be horizontalized, and it has to be managed as a horizontal process, not as a thing that's tucked in lots of different pockets and we can never see the whole end to end, even just within our four walls. That, I think that has to happen, but we have to kind of get under the bonnet to find out why it doesn't happen. Why isn't it so logical? Why isn't it happening?
Before we get started, if you like what you hear on this podcast, just check out the business of retail.ca and you'll find an excellent set of episodes and subject matters relevant to retailers specifically, but there are many messages and useful information for other business and other categories. So check it out, and here we go. Welcome, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newbury. I'm a senior executive on call, helping businesses in the make, move, sell flow of consumer goods and services. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available through my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check it out. As the business world faces much volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, organizations need to be tapping into resources with an inside edge on transitioning their teams to be agile, innovative and digital, with thought leaders, experts and senior executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations to help reorientate their enterprises. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started.
As retailers entered the lockdown in March 2020, a small, diverse group of Canadian thought leaders gathered to virtually speculate, collaborate, and share their insights on the waves of disruption facing retailers. The Business of Retail podcast emerged as an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional discourse, revealing challenges in the headlines and exploring new, unconventional paths for all facets of the retail industry. Now, here's the panel.
We're delighted as the Business of Retail podcasting crew to have this conversation. So that's George, David, Christine, Craig and myself, Gary. Between us, we've got about 150 years of expertise It's a bit hard for us to get our minds around because we all look so young. But that expertise stretches across all elements of retail, merchandising, supply chain, retail operations, you name it. We've been all over it. And that includes bricks and mortar, e-commerce and food service, commentating with authority, consulting as thought leaders, or managing organizations through both great and also challenging times. There's no glossy deck, no seeded questions here, and no canned laughter. We're going to have a live, real-time, authentic conversation. So it's very much on the tips of most people's tongue throughout this week. We're talking about Canadian retailers, but you can be talking about your own business. But what are the key challenges Canadian retailers must face as they look to assign more importance to the areas of supply chain resiliency, digital fulfillment capabilities, traditional peak trading activities and promotions? How are they going to assign more importance to these areas as they look beyond this crazy year?
Just before we start, Gary, I'd like to just point out that in the 150-year figure that you injected, some of us are a bit younger. So 4 of us are about 20 years each. You're carrying the balance. So just so the audience understands the metric.
Yeah, that's true.
We just wanted to correct you, Gary, to get it started off correctly.
Yeah, I know. I'm used to it. So, George, you want to run on this to start with?
Sure, you're firing it at me just because of that. Okay.
Yeah, that's if you're right.
All right, Gary, here it comes. All right, so you know what? I don't want to get on to COVID and what that's done. I think we've all bled to death over it already. We don't need any more of it. But, I think the challenges going forward are, what's the consumer going to do? How is that going to play out? We had a little bit of a brief discussion earlier, and I know Craig and David are going to jump in all over me in a few minutes when I say something wrong. But I look at it as the consumer's behavior is changing, and how does that change the dynamic in retail? And how does that change demand? How does that change what CEOs are thinking and doing, and how quick they can respond to a marketplace that continues and will continue to be volatile for a little bit longer? And I don't know how much longer that is, but it's going to put a lot of pressure on supply chain and planning for. I always used to kid about supply chain. It always starts off well with planning, but once panic, then the second P comes in, panic. It really screws the third P, which is performance. So, I think that's where I'm going to leave it off, and I'm going to pick on David to hammer at me now.
Okay, so it's interesting when you mentioned consumer change. I think what's really important is that everyone sort of understands at the very root what has been shifting underneath the surface in the retail sector. In Western, I'm going to say Western economies, because I think in Asia and emerging markets, a move to e-com has been for entirely different reasons. It's almost like, hey, we don't have any infrastructure. Why don't we just start with the latest version? But in Western economies, when there's so much legacy retail and systems already in play, kind of begs the question, even though people are inventing ways to do e-com, why is that change accelerating? And my own view is the consumers caught up to it, but there was a collision of forces that all hit kind of after the financial crisis. They were all building, but they kind of consolidated then. And those forces were really not specifically about the consumer. I think it was in the Western world, we had sort of flat population growth. So if you think about how does retail grow, and there's an imperative to grow, where there's population growth, you're going to get the opportunity to sell more. But we have flat growth, flat economies, or declining economies. At the very same time, there is an incredible increase in competition, and the web brought the world to us. But even in terms of physical, like Craig's been tracking entrance to Canada for years. And even up until the last couple of years, the number of new openings in Canada has been incredible. And same in the Western world, brands going direct and so on. At the very same time, I would say almost in every category for a given quality point, there's been deflation in that category, which means just to stay even, retailers had to sell more units just to stay at zero from prior years. And above all this, and maybe this is where the consumer plays in, there's a notion of abundance. Like, I think really in the Western world, in Canada, are we really lacking in anything? So 20, 30 years ago, people could build out a concept, and it could be it could be imperfect, but there's so much demand versus supply in the market that you're going to get your way through it. So I think that was kind of underneath all of it, not even talking about real estate. Like, a lot of the shift to e-com wasn't because consumers were asking at the time. It was more the CFOs going, where's our growth going to come from? If not top line, then we better make sure our bottom line's healthy. Real estate's costing us way too much. So I think those things were going on underneath. And then there's new developments in terms of technologies and such, but retail's offering the consumers new windows on how to shop. And shoppers are smart. They started to figure out how to gamify it, make it work for them. And there's no turning back. So I think it's important to know that, because as we go past the thinking of COVID and immediate response, a lot of those forces are still in play. And even as e-com becomes more widespread, the fact that there's imperfections in an e-com model are going to now bubble to the surface next. So I'll just leave that out on the table, and maybe we can circle back in a bit.
So can I just interject then? So I'm gonna point out to Christine. Christine, yes, I ran a poll, and the poll, I mean, it's a really low level one, but about 2,700 people responded to it. And the question was, how are you going to continue to, how are you going to shop over the next course of the balance of this year? 23% of them said they're going to do it online, right? And the way I look at things right now is that, okay, if 23% are going to buy online, what are the pressures that, that retailers and supply chains and designers are going to start facing to make sure that they meet that 23% demand?
Yeah, we were talking about this a bit earlier. I think, the digital first mentality has been something that a lot of major brands are really focused in on, and recognizing that wholesale model can be challenging, wanting to do direct to consumer, there's a lot of benefit to doing that. And what we're finding is, I think a lot of brands are now dealing with the challenge of how do you represent the storytell and the emotion and the feel of going into a brick and mortar on a digital platform. It's a lot more challenging. And then you've got just logistically, how do consumers navigate that platform? And you want to entice them and bring them in. And I think social media has been able to do that and bring the storytell in a quick, easy snippet. But you still need to be able to navigate and shop and find that product. And I think the other challenge is a lot of brands, and back to what David was saying, we're being everything to everybody. And we've got to find a sharper, more streamlined solution where we can be more sustainable, where we can have better economies of scale. That also helps the supply chain by being really focused on what are the key drivers in our businesses, to be able to focus on those and build, better infrastructure around that. But I think it's a really challenging paradigm right now, as we're forced to be online and be shopping digitally, and how do we manage through that? And I think also our time span is so sucked away right now with our Zoom calls and all of our work from home, that usually shopping is sort of a relief. You get out there, there's a social aspect, you're in an interesting environment, and now you're sort of in your digital environment. And how can brands and consumers kind of connect to your brand in that different way? And I think that's going to be sort of the next big challenge as we continue to move forward on these digital platforms.
So before I go to the supply chain guru in our group, I'm going to ask Craig. Craig, that was you, I was referring to you, Gary, just in case you missed it. Craig, you got access to a lot of what's going on out there. What's your view on all of this at this point?
Well, I mean, it's pretty clear that we've been pushed into the future, I think, in terms of adoption of technologies. We were already, I think, moving towards more of a digital age. It seems like we're really pushing forward with this now. I think this is going to create some really interesting complexities. I mean, investing in industrial property in terms of, buildings that store stuff is probably a good idea at this point. I think there's going to be a lot of home delivery. There's going to be far more click and collect, curbside pickup with retail. This is what I'm seeing is that, and actually I should ask, George, when you said was it 27% of respondents, was it 24%?
23.
23. And was that exclusively online? Like they're planning on doing
Yeah,
all?
they're it was 18% will do it with delivery, 5% will do curbside pickup.
Okay. I mean, that's substantial. That is, I think, already indicative of a change in the consumer. The consumer is, hesitating to go into physical spaces in many cases. There's, there's certain segments that will be doing that. But I think this speaks to a broader change in the overall consumer psyche, which is going to have, I think, a fairly profound transformation on retail. We talked about this a bit last night. If there is a possibility that there's no vaccine ever to be found that's effective for COVID-19, how are we going to live with this? Because these habits that we're forming, not to mention the continued concern amongst certain segments of the population for getting sick, I think are going to formulate habits which will continue to transform retail and move it more into a digital world. I mean, what I'm predicting and what I've spoken to some experts about is they're thinking that, yes, we will have physical stores. There will be fewer of them. They will be showcasing the brand and what they're about. And you may end up making that purchase in the store on your mobile device or on a pad, and they'll deliver it to your home. It's a different world out there. Canada Goose already has a store in Toronto, a suburban location where the jacket you try on in the store, if you are trying one on, is not the one that you're taking home. They will deliver another one to you. I think that we're going to be in for a really interesting few months, and into 2021, seeing how this all plays out, because we've got brands going online like they never have before, smaller retailers, groups like Digital Main Street that are getting retailers and other small businesses online, which I think is very, very necessary. I don't think physical retail is dead, but I do think that we are moving very rapidly into a digital world, which is interesting, but it's also a bit antisocial to a degree. I mean, when's the last time we all saw each other? Very long time.
Yeah, and you're right, because I mean, the number of retailers that are, I don't even know if I want to say they're getting out of bankruptcy. They're trying to recover from that. Usually they don't recover, but some of them are trying to resurrect themselves as online only. And then that will be very interesting if they are able to survive that way. If they couldn't do it with stores when they had all these grand strategies for digitization and it didn't happen, what makes them think it'll happen now? So Gary, you got our gist. Other than Craig's message about what happens if there's no vaccine, then I would ask you to figure out how we get hazmat suits to everybody. But what are your thoughts?
Well, on that whole era of vaccine distribution, it's a big challenge. I don't think people have really got their mind on it yet, but I'll just park that one up. I'm sure that's for another podcast at some stage in the future. I think the essence of what we said here is retail has to sharpen it about, as Christine calls it, the storytell. The reason why I go to shop or in store, the rest of the game is supply chain. If it goes digital, if it's click and collect, if it's even getting stuff onto shelves, it's all about the supply chain and its ability to respond to erratic demand, uncertainty. I think we're going to find retailers kind of separating into a couple of pockets. One will be those ones who get it and start to enhance and invest in the supply chain. And maybe we come back to what might prevent those or what are the challenges that they may face. And we can talk about that as a collective. And those ones that are kind of stuck and they still hold on to the concept that the store and merchandising is everything, because this is a model that's born out of 1927 and a study by Paul Mazar. These are the only two functions of a retailer: is what do we buy and sell, and how do we sell it through a store. Everything else was very much a periphery, including how it got into the store, and we didn't have click and collect back then. I don't think we did. But I think that we're going to see this polarization of retailing, those ones who sharpen up their message and get with the plan, get with the supply chain as the way that value is actually delivered to consumers, until in a product-based scenario, until the customer actually gets that thing in their hand, they can't consume it, they can't actually receive the value. That isn't delivered in a store. The customer has to go and retrieve it from the store. So I think that I'd like to think that retailers are kind of slowly getting the message. They know about the supply chain. They know the public's got the message that the supply chain heavily disrupted through the lockdown and what happened in China initially, and it really caused a lot of disturbance. But I think that we need to get beyond the general chat about the supply chain into what do we need to do to make our supply chain a competitive weapon.
What I'm trying to say is shoppers are catching up to things put in front of them and then taking it a step further, and then we're reacting to them. It's a joint journey. Anyone saying it's all about the customer journey is kind of just using it as a slogan. It's a journey that's going on between the supply of products, direct to consumer, retailers, and the customers, and it's all going to be chaotically moving forward. So that's going on under the hood of inside retail. And if I'm assuming you guys are senior who are listening in, historically, retail was designed exceptionally well for a very stable economy and a very step-by-step growth, like 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so it evolved into being these swim lanes of silos of activity, and it's all about lean and continual improvement. We're in such a disruptive, chaotic state right now that there's too many leaders continuing to try and use that kind of mindset, when what this really requires is design thinking and move to more strategic leadership, being multi-period, multi-department, not just do what you can with the tools at your disposal. So if you're a head of supply chain, historically, you've probably, I don't know all of you, but probably many of you have been treated like a support service within inside the business. And so the front of house has been the store of the future and all that kind of cool work. And then you guys were meant to just keep improving, keep making your thing more efficient. I think one of the big things you have to do is influence inside your business, the C-suite and the CEO, to realize supply chain is actually a strategic lever. And the reason I got connected with Gary is I realized a couple of years ago that store of the future is going to give way to supply chain of the future. So I better meet people who know that stuff, because I don't really know much about any one thing. But that's kind of the set. So when I'm looking at the chat, what I'd like to see you guys popping up with questions are like, how do we transform? Like, are there examples of how we end up seeing this holistically during chaos? Those are the kind of big questions you should be asking, not necessarily what tool is going to be deployed for next quarter.
And
Gary, you got to fill in. I would just insulted the whole group. Now you got to make it go really good.
No problem. I think, yeah, my assumption here is that the audiences that I've been a participant in are all very capable of understanding things like AI, machine learning, robotics, PRA, and all that lot. And particularly, there's been a lot of talk about pivoting, resiliency, and agility. So we kind of know what that means, but maybe as we execute these, let's call them strategies, because they're not really, they're just typically tactics as they're deployed, we bump into lots of issues, issues that we knew were in the business, but as we try and accelerate parts of the business and try and move in maybe a more responsive way, we trip over these things. And it leads me to suggest that it's not the guys in the supply chain that need a clearer vision of supply chain. I think this really does need to the point that David's just made, is the C-suite, the CEO really needs to get really animated about the quality of their supply chain and the kind of things they expect from it and what they're prepared to put in it. I think many of us will have been living in a world of cost per case. How much for my cost per case? It's gone up or down? It's gone down, it's good. Keep going. If it's gone up, oh, that's terrible. Let's get under the hood on this and try and work out how you can improve your warehouse or your transport fleet, or that supervisor needs to pull his weight. It's all highly tactical, when we should be thinking about the holistic nature of the supply chain, the horizontal nature of the supply chain, not just in our business, but beyond our business, down into our supply network. And if we're using partners, into our distribution network, if we're not distributing directly to stores ourselves with our own warehouse or our own trucks. And then we add into that kind of almost a variant on a supply chain called the singles picking and delivery and dispatching kind of supply chain, which is e-commerce. So there's a lot of complexity in this area, and we, the point that David made, is organised ourselves in these swim lanes, which may have suited the past to really make us, you know, turn up every day. We're doing our job. It's fine. It's great. But now this disruption has allowed us to think very much like the supply chain has to be horizontalized, and it has to be managed as a horizontal process, not as a thing that's tucked in lots of different pockets and we can never see the whole end to end, even just within our four walls. That, I think that has to happen, but we have to kind of get under the bonnet to find out why it doesn't happen. Why isn't it so logical? Why isn't it happening?
And Gary, just one thing there is a precursor decision that has to be made early on by the C-suite is, are we going to need to innovate our own supply chain, or is that out of our range? And maybe there needs to be consolidation of supply chains or more joint ventures between different brands and retailers, because why is everyone trying to reinvent the same thing? So some of you out there will be, that will be your game, your strategic bet, if you want to call it that. But that's not everyone's strategic bet. But that's a fundamental question that has to be asked early on in your dialogue.
Getting back to your point on the visibility, and I think the swim lane thing is a great analogy, because I think, especially from my experiences that I've had, quite often, and unless there's a disruption, it's just let them do their thing and it's all good. But there needs to be this understanding from the entire organization of how the supply chain works, and really diving deep into understanding it to be able to better react and shift and move, Gary, your favorite word, pivot, around it. And I think that a lot of the times we don't really worry about that. We're not planning crisis management. We're not looking at the challenges that might be coming. We wait for it to hit us. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity around that, about the strategy of how do you look towards that? What are the things you're going to have to do to be more nimble and shift? And I think what has been really challenging, but also really great, is because of the situation that we're in, it's forced us to recognize how critical this is to consumers. When we walked in the doors and couldn't find our toilet paper and had challenges getting dishwashing liquid or whatever else it was, all of a sudden that completely changes the dynamic of a consumer and their trust in a brand or in a store to be able to access those products. Then it forces them online, and then the challenges of things being out of stock. And so there's just a lot of things that have sort of been happening that we've been so reactive to. And I think, like, how do you get more focus on, how do you plan for those crisis moments? How do you look through your supply chain and see where those pain points might come up? And again, I am not an expert in this area, so I'm the first to admit that I think there are a lot of challenges, but I think it's just thinking through that. And it's also the entire organization has to understand better what's happening and how they need to address it and look forward to move and fix the problems.
And by the way, for those who don't know Christine, she's had senior roles over many years with both Nike corporate out of Portland and Adidas Golf. And so you're coming at it with that. I mean, those are pretty solid businesses we're talking about when you're talking about struggles you've seen. There's a guy, Matt Wilkinson out there. Now that's an interesting point if you check the chat. Just talking about the notion of consumer sector procurement, where you actually start thinking of consumers being the start of a procurement process. That's actually quite an interesting metaphor. So yeah, I think that aligns with the theme today.
And I think that the conversation or the question here about consumer behavior on brand and store loyalty is also really important, because as we as consumers start to have frustration with not being able to get products or returns and things not being as timely as they were, we're going to most likely go to the places and the brands and the things that will provide those things. So I think sometimes we're able to be a little more forgiving through this situation, but as things start to turn around, I think that nature of us wanting to have what we need when we need it is going to start to bubble up again. And I think there's a lot of frustration when you're ordering something and you expect it to be there. It's probably going to be there 2 weeks later than you wanted it to, and now it's pushed out another 3 weeks. And so there's things like that where I think it's really a tender moment for brands and how they build relationships with consumers and build that trust and the confidence in their brand and their ability to deliver.
Well, we've tracked online through holiday since 2010, when Black Friday came on the scene. We started tracking through surveys right after, like the Tuesday after Cyber Monday, what people did. And it's been interesting watching that adoption. But what's interesting is it's still not every shopper out there takes part in those massive commoditizations of goods online. A lot don't like it. It's moving a little bit, but I think all of us, I hope on this discussion in the audience, know that even with surges in e-com, they're nowhere near what store sales levels were at prior to COVID. And the early warning we saw in the past few years was all the breakpoints that were happening at Black Friday and over the holiday season, where orders were incorrect because of the rush to pack and the delays and the mistakes. And then and you just touched on reverse supply chain, which from a consumer perspective is maybe that's one of the newer strategic forces facing the supply chain folks, is this notion of a reverse supply chain. But Craig, when you mentioned that you see stores disappearing, let's not call them stores, but I think the idea of physicality in the consumer procurement process, to coin Matt Wilkinson's phrase, or to repeat it, I think physicality is still going to be there, because I think shoppers are trying to figure out how to make all this work for them. And I'm going to tell you, e-com's not the answer everyone thinks it is, at least not yet. There's a lot of, and as Christine, you mentioned, there's a lot of friction in that, but there's a lot of money behind trying to make e-com be the sort of the golden child of everything, but it's not. It's about a blend and how customers get something in a way they need that isn't universal. There's different segments and different needs.
You know, I think the other part of the equation, though, is that how are each organization structured? Every one of them is going to be different. And I've lived a corporate life where I've seen supply chain reporting to CFOs, and I've seen it to reporting to other functions. I think that I believe that the timing is right for a lot of organizations. Going to have to break that cookie cutter, and they're going to have to create what works for them, because you're going to need to be very, very fluid and not react, and become proactive and reactive at the same time, because it's that agility piece that Gary was referring to. And that's not going to happen if you still have a structure that's old school, when the old school is kind of already got a few flat tires and it's not moving that fast anymore.
Well, and the only thing that really, this may be self-serving a little bit, in that we do work a lot with consumer strategy or customer strategy, but it seems like that's the only subject matter that really unifies every department. Like if it's all about logistics, it's going to be housed under supply chain and maybe across into IT. But what's needed is a discussion that gets people out of their silos and focused on something together as a group. And there's no one the customer. That's the silly thing. It's a customer, but having plausible high value scenarios and then having the whole organization think holistically about it is a new skill set. It's not something, even with our clients, they're used to doing. And so any change of behavior is pretty hard, especially during adverse conditions, but I don't see any other way out. I think just working harder, this idea of Agile being a proxy for just scrambling around, reactively trying to go harder and harder at things and throw stuff at the wall. I'm not trying to belittle it, but Agile is a very disciplined kind of IT technology approach, but we're seeing it used euphemistically a lot, and without a lot of, there's testing all over the place, but very little learning. All these are behavior changes that the leadership at the very top has to start indoctrinating rather quickly through the organization. That's the actual change in retail that has to happen. It's not the superficial, we got to have a better e-com platform. Those are
a lot of the businesses that I get to see by way of investment. When you start peeking in, private equity will always say, they look at it, they're great. When they look at a business, usually it needs to be, the organization needs to be professionalized. And when you look at supply chain, when you look at manufacturing within the organizations that are doing internal manufacturing, things are a mess. But most of these organizations that are floundering or failed, they are in disarray. And I think you're past, in many instances, and I believe those organizations still operate today. I know of a few, and they have not improved anything. So I really question how they're going to compete in this marketplace today if they don't get their houses in order soon.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, the vision's there. I've dealt with some legacy retail that still has the head in the sand. They think, hey, we just need to keep improving lean. But I'll give MEC as an example, an illustrative example. Critique him all you want on execution, but David Labister actually did have the vision to see that dramatic change had to happen fast, and a co-op model didn't allow really for the capital raise to properly do it. So it fell short, but he did see that. He agonized over not moving fast enough. But there's also culture, and like the bigger the organization is, and with a lot of success in its history, it becomes harder and harder to turn that ship around. And some of the really cool models tend to be upstarts, like younger brands that are bubbling up, but they don't have any scale and they're not there yet. But they're kind of building it to suit the modern era. So you kind of go, that's cool. But they have their own issues in terms of scaling properly.
To offer a perspective, and it's one I've shared with this group before, but just for the benefit of the audience, that when I think about Canadian retail and the history of it, and how organisations have responded, they've attempted to grow, so they've built bigger stores, more stores, and put more product in them, and they've tried to grow, and they've probably hit diminishing returns. So they've turned and said, how are we going to save costs? Because to keep our cash flow working, we have to find cheaper ways of doing things. So often they've taken people off the floor, so services dropped. They may have gone across to extended geographical supply chains, like buying stuff from China because it's cheaper, bring that into the store. When actually, as they reached that point of diminishing returns, they should have been saying to themselves, I think there's something more we need to do here, and it's not just adding more estate. It may actually be reinventing our whole retail proposition. And that's a step that seems to be missing. And it doesn't help that for many retailers, their marketing hasn't been at the top of the organisation. It's been sort of to the side as really a peripheral activity that looks after the flyer. I think these are important, much the same as you were describing, like the last 10, 15, 20 years of stuff going on behind the scenes where the consumer and the retailer are kind of joining on this journey to a better time. That step also is another factor in that, generally speaking, many retailers have been in the decline stage of a retail concept where they've gone through a period of saturation, good margins, good volumes, and also they've gone into this area where they're having to rethink things, but their rethinking is how do we attack costs, not how do we reinvent our retail concept to get back onto that growth and maturation kind of stage. And I don't see that kind of analysis being talked about within retail circles too often, and that sidestep of marketing has probably added to that, because that's really the job of marketing, is to see where our profitable segments are and what do we need to do to our formats, our presentation of our brand in the marketplace. What do we need to do to that? And it doesn't mean just changing the logo, as many retailers think that's a reinvention. It's actually looking at the whole concept of what our go-to-market strategy is.
Gary, I think what makes that complicated is the scaled organizations big enough to maybe have the thing we haven't spoken about is having cash in the bank right now, because that's going to be an indicator of who's on the other side of all this. But the really big ones tend to be pubcos. They're publicly traded. And I think one of the other variables here is it takes a pretty brave leader to say, we're going to take a hit on quarterly or annual comp sales because we're going to do something that's going to make sure we're viable in 5 years. And I think if you're privately held, like I'd love to see Nordstrom get Nordstrom back in the family, and whether or not department stores are viable generally, they're an interesting leadership group and they may have a shot. But when you're always doing your quarterly reporting, it's hard to do what you're talking about, which is let's reimagine the whole thing. And there's no point reimagining it unless you're prepared to act on that. So but I agree with you, but it might be some private, there could be some out there we don't know about that are privately held that as we speak are working on it. We just won't know. There was a comment in the group here by Craig Patterson.
That's all I can say. That's all I can say.
Craig, if you want to know it, you got to follow Craig Patterson on Retail Insider, because if you ever want to know something before anyone else knows it, Craig's the guy. Julia raised something. I realized I was referring to leaders in retail and consumer goods earlier, but I think there's a lot of suppliers to the sector in the audience today. And she was asking about how do you encourage, I guess, I'm assuming you're a vendor, how do you encourage cleaning up the whole online side of grocery? The only thing I would advise is understand that you're saying that someone else is pitching them with something else there's so many things that have to get fixed all at once. And that's important to you because that's the business you're in. The more you can understand the decision makers in retail and what they're prioritizing and when they're prioritizing it, whatever you're doing, you can make it more relevant to them. But if it's kind of push selling your solutions, it's so noisy, I think, for a retail exec right now. They're getting hit by everybody.
And they're all, I'm sure, David, I'm sure, and you're as connected as I am, and I know Craig is, that I'm sure a lot of retailers out there right now are month to month. Yeah. You know, that's how they're dealing with, and some maybe even week to week. It is forecasting and trying to, and there's other industries that I'm involved in, trying to forecast anything at this point out for a year or 2 years is a gamble. And just working it month to month and understanding how things are changing, because it's changing so fast and can reverse itself in a direction you don't want to go into. I think those are the challenges, those are leadership challenges right now and organizational challenges that are in play. What always plays in my mind is Peter Drucker, marketing and innovation, right? But that is probably the one thing that I'll always say to everybody, no matter what circumstances, keep thinking marketing and innovation, whether you're dealing with this on a weekly or a monthly or a quarterly basis. That's what you should be doing. Because otherwise you can lose focus pretty darn quick by getting wrapped up in the minutia of the issues that you're faced with. And I've seen organizations just get lost in that very quickly.
Christine, can you unpack maybe what might have happened behind this? Like Nike's just been releasing some tremendous stories around how they've done of late, but it wasn't always like that, right? It's been sort of an up and down thing over the last maybe 5-6 years. Is there anything you can share in terms of what were the ingredients that may have been invested in a few years ago that took a while, but now it's showing up?
I would say Nike's definitely was one of the leaders in terms of getting to more of a digital focused platform. But yeah, they've really been focused on that. And I think part of that focus has been on more control of their own brand. And definitely these brands built themselves on their wholesale partnerships and they're really important. But at the same time, I think what they've been doing is kind of pulling back a bit and saying, we're out there in space, in all these different doors, we need to kind of consolidate and pull back in and sort of hone in on what's important to us and our brand and how we represent our brand. Because again, with the consumer first philosophy, the consumer's going to decide. And if your brand's represented poorly, a partner that maybe wouldn't be your top choice, or you're not able to tell the story of your product because the guy on the floor is on his phone and not paying attention. I mean, those might be extreme examples, but brands want more control, and it's the Nikes, the Audis, the other brands that are starting to recognize that, and you're seeing more brand-owned doors than you've ever seen before. I mean, I think I'd look at Canada Goose as a great example where they've now really they're pulling back. They want more control. They've got more focus on doing their own branded stores, controlling their message, controlling their product line and what they're putting out there. And I think the big thing with these brands too is, again, managing through being able to forecast and plan. And I think to George's point, the demand plan and forecast piece of it right now is really, really incredibly challenging. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know where consumers are shifting. I mean, the one thing that's sort of in the bright spot, I think, in the sports and fitness industry is that consumers are home, we're spending more time. So brands like Peloton and Mirror and all these other brands that are allowing us to be at home and be healthy and do things, those things are starting to pick up. And with that, you'll start to see that footwear and apparel for working out becomes more in trend. And the Today Show today was talking about how women's pumps, fashion shoes are down, and sport and athletic running shoes are all on trend because we're all at home or we're working out or those types of things. So it's part of it's like just being able to be nimble and shift and know what consumers are facing right now and how are we dealing with things and what are we looking to do and what do we want to buy. But I think there's there's a real focus now on how do these bigger brands tell their stories. And we talked about it a little earlier in their brick and mortar, but also from a digital perspective. And then how do they bring that product to life and provide it at the right time in the right place? And many of these brands basically shut the pipeline off and said, we're not going to do they'll do a quarterly hit. We're not going to do our summer delivery because we just don't think that the consumer is going to want that product when they're out in retail 3 months later or 4 months later. So there's also a lot of focus on bringing product that is more seasonless. So we typically have in this industry your spring, summer, fall, winter, and you're bringing different products in at different times. And I think now there's this need for just being more, what would be a product mix that consumers could tap into at any one point in time. And maybe, again, a consolidation and a focus. But I think that's the key, is like, how do you focus in on what are the volume drivers? What are the things that mean something to your consumer? And some of the fluff or maybe the other extraneous things have to be put aside right now until we can get to a place where consumers have the headspace to look at that again.
Christine, merch plays such a role with distribution and supply chain, right? So in your experience of late, how many, Nike or otherwise, how many organizations would you say are really data literate in the merch area, and that buyers have been, as a group, have been trained to go from just projecting out from past into the future and are actually better at demand forecasting? Because it seems like that's the key ingredient to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I think that the demand planning and forecasting piece is huge. A lot of brands will, especially with their wholesale partners, partner with them to secure strategy, plan, and demand. And then they'll have economies of scale when they, go into it. And a lot of that comes down to how are you going to market a story? What are you going to stand behind? What are going to be the key drivers for that season? And then having everyone sort of buy into that strategy and story. And then that allows these larger brands to secure the volume that they need, get better pricing, materials, etc. So I think there's a lot more of that. And there's more of a partnership than ever with wholesale brands to be able to say, this is the journey we want to take our consumer on. We need you to partner with us. And in the past, I think it was a little bit like, well, this is what a Dick's or another sporting goods brand might want, and you'd be tailoring it to them. And I think now there's a shift back to like, how do we collectively take the insights that we have from consumers and help drive that through wholesale, but also drive it through our own channel?
What you both just did is reminded me that, and I already told David I don't think I want to run a retail company again, but if I were, just based on what I heard you both say, every Monday, most retail organizations look through their dashboard and they look at all their KPIs, go through every number to hash out how they did. Today, I would be doing that. And I would say if supply chain is not sitting at that revenue, at that sales table, when you're talking, you're making a mistake. And second, the number one only question you should be asking around that table of every function is, what else can we do? Because that is the most important question in my mind that I would, after listening to Christine mostly, that sparks in my head is, what else can we do in each function to continue to bring the revenue in and continue to excite the customer, make the experience better, make the supply chain effective, give them what they need. There's a lot of conversations that should be happening. And sometimes I don't know, there's silos in organizations and they don't always allow that fluid conversation to happen.
And if you were a client of mine, I'd say in that cadence of meetings, not all of them, but on a maybe quarterly or twice a year basis, I would actually, with a core group, I would widen that meeting to include non-competing competitors with similar roles, just to kind of be checking in. And I would include some of the people in this audience are vendors. To go from someone just selling to a retailer to becoming a real partner takes a lot of effort. But for the ones that cross over, I think the future needs to be a little bit more open and transparent and have a lot more collaboration, not just inside across departments, but with other parts of the ecosystem of retail. And that's what I'd be encouraging, just to beta test that. Maybe you do it once a year to start. But you're on the right track. You need those. And everyone says we don't want any more meetings. Well, it's because you're crap at running meetings. If you're good at running meetings with a beginning, middle, end, and a purpose, then you should be having these, because there's no way you're going to move the ship. without them.
And maybe the exit for CPGs who are pretty fed up with their relationship with retailers, aren't getting that relationship sewn in with their ultimate consumers, and dying to have. I think that the next 5 or 10 years or less, we'll see a massive shift in CPGs doing exactly what you suggested, David, working with allied potential partners to create a supply chain which is D2C at scale, a massive scale. So you may see, who knows, Kraft, Nestle on complementary product ranges go and say, hey, should we do this together and just cut out the intermediary, the retailer? So there is some pressure on retailers to learn how to collaborate. And it's been a long time in coming. They've gone through the adversarial, this is the annual review. They've gone through the partnership, which looked like that anyway, but it was called partnership. We've had a little bit of collaboration through the COVID because there was a real constraint on all our major grocers going to Conagra, Nestle's, Kraft saying we need, and the total requirement was much less than they could produce, even working 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So they had to work together to get something on their shelves. So they kind of got a sense of collaboration, but I think there's a long way to go. And it's whether or not the patience of CPGs will be there long enough to help the retailer turn itself around into a much more willing business partner in this journey.
Well, you need a shared enemy in life to bring opposing forces together. So there needs to be a catalyst. Maybe that's the moment of the pandemic, and it's not just throw landlords in the mix, right? But the whole sector is being adversarial. Like it's always been these negotiated moments and then break apart. And I'd love to see more effort, beta tests. And Christine has been following the story of Allbirds. And
I'm just going to say that I think the collaboration piece, if you look at Allbirds, who do a sustainable story, they've got wool recycled product, and then they've partnered now with Adidas, and they're trying to find a closed loop solution. So they're looking to the greater good to say, we both have something that we can partner together on to come up with something that is going to be better environmentally, and then share those best practices. You're seeing Lululemon's doing some similar things as well, partnering with other organizations for more sustainable materials and things that they're doing. But I think what's really, really cool is this concept of collaboration amongst brands that typically would be competitive with each other, and just the kind of work that can be done. And I think you look at in fashion, collabs are happening all over the place, and you've got really unique brands already doing well on their own, starting to collaborate and come up with really compelling and interesting product for consumers. Now, granted, those are on a smaller scale, but I think there's something really interesting to that, and the shared best practices. And we all in our world share our best practices, but I think often when you get into that environment where you're in a highly competitive state, there's a fear factor of opening the kimono so someone can see all the secrets behind. And I think COVID sort of forced us to say, well, we might have to partner together, especially for smaller and mid-tier brands. Like, what is the solution going to be? We might have to tap into shared service and shared function, and that might be the only way to survive.
Well, Hugo on the chat has just pointed out the desire for maybe shared data transparency in the supply chain. So again, good point that there's going to be places where you can't share, but it should be starting with the idea of sharing first. There's too many retailers out there who said, we're different than everyone else, so we don't want to learn from anyone else. But also this notion of we're petrified about sharing anything. And it's so funny because you can walk in the store and see what they're doing. But maybe have a culture of share first unless there's a good reason not to, as opposed to we're never going to share. Hugo, good point.
But I think sharing and partnership is going to be mainstream, because if you look at the restaurant industry, they have a huge supply chain that serves them. And Gary, I'm going to guess what it was the 80s, where in the UK, a lot of distilleries are buying up a lot of pubs. I can't imagine that won't happen here, because all the distillers are struggling as well. I mean, these restaurants are not performing anywhere near what it used to be. And I can see some consolidation. I can see partnerships happening. And I think that's just reality coming our way.
Anytime we have a question about drinking, we tend to point to Gary for some reason, but
Yeah, I don't know.
Weirdly. So is any last thoughts to kind of wrap this up? Any golden gems that we want to share?
if I were in a career right now that was either vendor or retailer or packaged goods, and I'm in supply chain, I'd be pushing. I'd either say I'm going to accept the status quo and just collect my salary, but I'd be keeping an eye out whether my company is sending signals that it's morphing at its core, like there's culture shift going on, and not just trying to keep patching something. And if it's not, I don't know. I'd be deciding, am I the one to champion that change? And if I'm not up for it, I'd be looking elsewhere where someone might be, because it's also at a very personal level. It's your careers that are in the balance right now the next few years.
I think on that point, Will, I think it's a well-made point, especially for this audience. So over to you, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary, Christine, David, George, and Craig. And speaking about collaboration and sharing, I want to take this moment to thank our colleagues at CITT for introducing us to Gary and this panel of retail experts. So a very good example of what you were talking about is happening in our industry as well, where we're collaborating with other associations, hopefully for the benefit of our participants. I really want to thank you all for sharing your insights and your expertise.
You have been listening to the Business of Retail podcast, an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional industry discourse. Thank you for joining us. For more information, please go to www.thebusinessofretail.ca.
Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your team. You can connect with me via the website retail.ca and go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn by typing linkedin.com/in/last-mile. Look forward to hearing from you and playing an active part with your supply chain and your business's transformation as you start to act boldly, think big, scale, adapt, and win.